So I work for the Tennessee Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence. I want to tell you a little bit about the coalition. We're a statewide service agency, and we're located here in Nashville, but our services branch out across Tennessee. We provide technical assistance training, and we do policy work on issues related to domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. And I'm the legal counsel there. Generally, our services are like technical assistance and training. We really don't have direct victim services, except for our two clinics. We have a sexual assault clinic, and we have a immigrant legal clinic, and we provide free legal services to immigrant victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. And we provide free services to any sexual assault victim. So if you know somebody who's a victim of sexual assault, they can be referred to our agency for what we call a legal checkup. So, but today I'm here to do an arm of our work is training. And we're going to be talking a little bit about dynamics of domestic violence and how that relates to housing. So I always like to start off when I'm talking about dynamics of domestic violence is kind of the state policy and framework and philosophy on domestic violence. The state law has has a set of laws called the Order Protection Act. And embedded in that Order Protection Act is a statement about Tennessee's philosophy on domestic violence. And essentially, the statement says that domestic abuse is important, and that victim safety should be paramount, and batterers should be held accountable. Because we do a lot of victim blaming in our society, so we blame victims for what happened to them. I was invited to be on Channel 5 Open Live to talk about victim blaming in the Vanderbilt rape case. So we had a lot of interesting calls, and the culture, we live in a victim blaming culture. So let's talk a little bit about domestic violence behaviors. One thing I want to point out is that all domestic violence behaviors are not criminal in nature. All right, so all domestic violence behaviors are not criminal in nature. However, when domestic violence meets the definition of abuse by Tennessee law or assault definition, then it can become criminal in nature, and legal intervention is possible at that point. So I'm going to flip back between this slide and this other slide. Hopefully you can read your handout better than you can read the slide up here. But this will encourage you to go back to your desk and print out the power and control wheel so that you can actually read what it says on here. I would encourage everybody to actually print out a power and control wheel, especially if you're working with tenants in your housing offices. This is really helpful for victims to kind of see themselves on this power and control wheel. So when we talk about domestic violence, we're talking about not about anger, not that somebody's angry, but we're actually talking about power and control. Someone using power to try to control the other person through means of violence. So means of violence is not just physical violence, but we're also talking about emotional abuse and even financial abuse, okay? So I had a person, for example, I had a person who was not allowed to work, okay? The spouse would not let the other spouse work, so the spouse could not earn money and was controlled by the money of the abusive spouse. And so we consider that domestic violence, although it doesn't meet the statutory definition of abuse or assault, but it is still domestic violence. So name calling, for example, calling somebody every time they wake up on you're MF, you're MF, you're MF. That is verbal abuse. It's name calling, and it's devaluing, and its purpose is to control the victim. All right, and so also on here, you can barely see it, but threats to children. I'm going to take custody of the children if you report this abuse, or threats to pets. So injury to pets. Now, injury to pets will give rise to legal intervention. But these are examples of domestic violence, okay? So have any of you all seen A Diary of a Mad Black Woman? That is a good example of financial abuse, because this woman did not work, and this abuser had taken all the financial control and not put anything in her name, and this was really, she was totally dependent upon him for financial stability. So that's a good example of financial abuse, but hot grits will lead you to an aggravated assault. Just a FYI. Okay. So, and it will lead to legal intervention. Okay, so when we talk about legal intervention when domestic violence arises to the level of domestic abuse, according to Tennessee law, we're talking about threats or threats to injure pets, the person, or property. So if you threaten, so let's suppose I had a roommate, and my roommate was always kicking my dog. Just kicking my dog, saying, I'm going to beat your dog, and that kind of thing. I could get an order of protection against my roommate because we're in a domestic relationship. We live together, okay? So if you're in a domestic relationship, you live together, roommates, or you've had a sexual relationship with a person, dated, married, have been related by blood or marriage, or have children in common, you're considered to be in a domestic relationship. So that would include also in-laws as well. So if you're in a domestic relationship and the person in that domestic relationship injures the other person or threats to injure that person's person or pets or property, then this person is considered a domestic abuse victim under the statute. So in that case, the person would be eligible for what is called an order of protection. So, and we're going to talk a little more about order protections as we progress through the slide presentation. Domestic violence becomes criminal when the person is put in fear of being of bodily injury, or there is an actual bodily injury. Okay, so that is considered assault, and it's considered domestic assault if you're in one of those relationships as I just described. So if my roommate hits me or puts me in such a state of fear that I think I'm going to be injured, then that roommate has committed what is called domestic assault. So that is criminal. Now, the order of protection that I just mentioned is civil in nature. So, but it becomes criminal if there is a violation. So you violate the civil order of protection, it will turn criminal. All right, there's that power and control wheel. So what are barriers from victim control? You might hear this information and say, oh my gosh, I could never be in that situation. Oh my goodness, that person needs to get out of that relationship. But there are so many barriers to victims leaving. And when the panel comes, they will share with you some of the challenges that they had in leaving their domestic relationship. And the survivor we had yesterday, she was outstanding. And she talked about this control and how her batterer used religion to control her. And in fact, her batterer was a religious leader in the church and had abused her for over a year in terrible ways, and was really heroic for this victim to share all the ways that this man abused her and used religion as a tool to keep her in that abusive situation. He even made her get her name changed legally. So he did a lot of things to hurt this woman, but she is out of it, and she has a great job, in fact. But religion I don't have up here, but I kind of consider that cultural, that is a barrier for victims to leave. Sometimes there are cultures that have domestic violence and don't understand that this is wrong, okay, that this is not appropriate, that it's power and control. So you're dealing with these cultural challenges and helping victims to know that they do not have to live in this kind of suffering. All right, so financial control. We just talked a little bit about financial abuse. So the victim is not allowed to work, and the victim is given an allowance. And the victim decides, I want to leave this relationship because, as you know, domestic violence escalates. So it may start out as name calling and then escalate to physical abuse. So the victim decides to leave this financially controlling relationship, but can the victim afford an attorney? Probably not. Can the victim afford an attorney to deal with custody of her children? Probably not. So, and it's all because of this financial control. So this other issue of isolation. Okay, so we have batterers that will isolate the victim, keep the victim away from her family. Okay, so or make her look bad in front of the family. Now, what batterers will do is they will look good in front of everybody else. So when the victim comes and says this person is abusing me, nobody really can believe that this really nice person is abusive. Okay, and so I want to also remind people that victims are not just women. Men get abused too. So there are men victims of domestic violence. So this isolation can be done in different ways, all right? So it can be physically taking the person away from their family, cutting off friendships. It's either me or your mother. It's either me or your best friend, that kind of thing. So that's isolation, or making people believe that the victim is a liar, okay? If you're old school and remember, what was that called, with J.R. Dallas? I mean, that's a good example of, what was her name, Mary Ellen? I can't remember her name. Sue Ellen. Wrong show. Sue Ellen was definitely isolated from her family, and J.R. would do different things to make her look crazy, okay? And which is a lot of batterers use that word crazy. So when people want to report, people really don't believe what's going on, okay? Threats to children. So if you leave me, I'm going to kill the children. All right, batterers will kill their children. So if you have seen, I like these movies because some of these movies really bring domestic violence to life, especially if you haven't been exposed to it otherwise. For colored girls who considered suicide, you saw that the batterer, that abuse was just escalating with that lady, and eventually he killed the children. So batterers do kill their children, and it just doesn't happen in Hollywood. It happens in true life. Okay, so immigration status is another. So I'm going to have you deported if you report the abuse. So we help in our clinic in these types of situations where we can work to obtain status without the abusive spouse based upon the abuse. Fear. This person's going to kill me if I try to leave. The most dangerous time for a victim is when the victim decides to leave. And I say this one for last because that's what we're here to talk about, is housing. Housing is a big barrier for victims to leave. You have 2 domestic violence shelters here in Nashville. You have the YW, and Sarah Martin from the YW is going to be here today, this afternoon, and she's going to talk about the YW services. And then you have also Morning Star. Is a shelter here in town. So you have 2 shelters. You're in Nashville, and you could imagine that those 2 shelters cannot hold every victim of domestic violence, okay? So housing is a big issue. And housing also becomes an issue because a victim might fear breaking their lease. I cannot leave. The person is stalking me, but I cannot leave because I'm afraid to break my lease. There's no money to fulfill the lease agreement. So if I want to kick my batterer out of the house, how am I going to pay for the rest of the rent because I've been financially controlled? And another reason why a victim may want to leave the housing situation is because they were sexually assaulted or stalked at their particular residence. I had one victim who was raped by a serial rapist in another county, and she fled. She just left her lease agreement and came to another county. So we're going to talk a little bit about lease agreements as we go through the PowerPoint presentation. Kind of just bringing awareness to this important issue of housing and domestic violence. Okay, so housing is a barrier for victims to being safe, just as we discussed in the previous slide. Just like I said before, victims are injured in their own housing, and stalking, hey, I might need to leave this complex because I'm being stalked. Okay, the stalker knows where I live. Okay, and then we talked about this financial issue where victims can't leave their situation because they cannot fulfill the lease agreement. And so these are actual issues that I talked about. I talked to you about the rape victim who had to leave her house, and she just left, broke her lease, and came to another county. Now, why are these actual cases important? It's important because we need laws that will allow victims to leave their leases, to get out of situations so they can get to safety without the risk of being penalized, reported to the credit bureau. So we need to give victims a way to get out of these situations and get to safety. And that's why we had worked on some legislation for the coalition, because of this rape victim, because of this situation where the landlord raped the victim, and the victim was granted an order of protection, and the judge allowed her to break the lease under a law that I'm going to talk to you about in just a minute, but did not give her her deposit back. So she had saved up for this deposit. She was sexually assaulted, and she did not get her deposit back, and she's actually working with our clinic now. And then, of course, we have the stalking victim at the bottom there. Without the law, the court was forced, without this law that I'm about to talk to you about, victims of domestic violence and sexual assault and stalking became responsible for penalties related to their lease agreements. And believe you me, I have been on the phone with apartment people trying to get victims out of their lease agreements, and did not have a leg to stand on, and will not have a leg to stand on if this particular law if this particular law is not in effect based upon the legal situation of the victim. And then we've already talked about that issue. Okay, so I was getting these calls from victims, and I said, we need to work on this legislation. So I went to Kathy Walsh, who is our executive director, and she does all of our policy work. And I said, we really need to look at creating a statute that will allow victims to leave their apartment leases uninhibited. So we came up with a piece of legislation to respond to this issue. Now, I believe there are probably about 30 plus states who have such a law in place. All right, so we did research and we gathered some language on how to deal with this issue. So we came up with a bill that would indeed allow victims to break their leases. And we also included in a, we would limit damages to 1 month's rent, okay? And we thought that allowing victims to break their lease would be a plus for victims. Obviously, it's a huge safety resource. And we also thought this would be helpful for landlords because domestic violence causes injury to property. And that this would give landlords the benefit of moving the domestic violence or risk to other tenants elsewhere. All right. So as I said, we looked at other states to come up with this language. And we found, based upon other state laws, that most states had an automatic termination of lease, but we did have a 1 month penalty in ours. Permission to change locks without cost to victims. We added some lock change language to our bill. And also, they suggested protection orders, letters from shelters, and police reports to be used to document that the person indeed is a victim of domestic violence. And just as I said, some had no penalty for termination. Some had 1 month. Oh, what did I do? Okay. All right. So how do we do this? I've kind of gotten ahead of myself. So we, as I said before, we put together this bill, just like the language from other states. We tried to pass this bill, but we ran into some opposition. One thing that we ran into is that people had concerns that the landlord should not be penalized for the victim being abused, stalked, and raped. Smells like victim blaming. Landlords giving up their contractual rights. Why should landlords be treated differently than a mortgage holder? There was a lot of victim blaming and much needed information about the dynamics of domestic violence and sexual assault, because the law would apply to stalking, sexual assault, and domestic violence victims. The proposed legislation did not pass committee. We worked with the apartment association and we were just not able to overcome this opposition for this beautiful piece of legislation. So the coalition worked to open the Order Protection Act. So it's that law that we started talking about earlier. So at the last hour of the legislative session, I believe in 2010, we opened up the Order Protection Act, and we managed to add some language to the provisions of the Order Protection Act, which define what remedies are available to a person who is granted an order of protection. So that law is 363606. So if you go into 363606, you will see what an order of protection, or how an order of protection can help a victim of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking. Have a safe trip. One of those provisions we added was that if a person is a victim of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking and is granted this order of protection, and the judge deems it a safety issue, the judge will permit the victim to break the lease, but the victim will still be responsible for any damages related to the lease. The law also asks that the respondent is responsible for damages related to the breaking of that lease. So what it actually does is create a third-party claim against the respondent. And the respondent is the person who the order of protection is against, okay? So what this means is, let's suppose I get an order of protection against my roommate, okay? So my roommate, I can break the lease. The judge says this is dangerous for me to be in this apartment. I can break the lease, but I'm still responsible for the $300 that I have left on the lease agreement. But I can bring a third-party claim against the respondent if he does not pay, or she does not pay for the breach of the lease. All right? So you might say to yourself, why would the respondent pay it? Well, here's the motivation. If the respondent does not pay for the damages related to the termination of the lease, the respondent would have broken the order of protection, or violate the order of protection, and could be held criminally liable for violation of the order of protection. So the person could actually go to jail for violating the order of protection for failure to pay for the damages related to the termination of the lease. And this is very critical because there's not really much to hold the respondent accountable for reimbursing or paying directly the damages related to the lease agreement. Does that make sense? So it's like this third-party claim the victim can bring against the respondent, and hopefully the victim wouldn't have to go through the process of doing a third-party claim, that the respondent would just go ahead and pay for the damages as ordered by the order of protection. So in that example that I gave you, where the landlord is actually the perpetrator of the violence, the landlord should be ordered to pay for many reasons, the deposit back to this particular tenant. All right. So that's the respondent's incentive to pay: jail and fines. All right. So now, what are we doing now with this legislation? So there is a bill in session there is a bill in play this session called the Secure Home Act, and essentially it's a locks change bill. So a victim can request that her locks be changed at no cost. On the second request, the victim must pay for the locks to be changed. And so there are some time limits in changing the locks. So locks change is good, and it will take us a step forward if passed. So let's look at some best practices in dealing with housing and domestic violence. Be aware of the dynamics of intimate partner violence. I wish I could educate every single person on the earth about dynamics of domestic violence, so that people could understand some of the choices victims make and how difficult it is to leave out of these situations. Be aware of how housing is a tool of power and control, and is a safety obstacle for many victims. And be aware of the provisions of state and federal law. And I know you have been looking at those earlier this morning that permit victims to change their housing situation without penalty, and advocate for improved housing safety laws for victims. And bless you, this is my information here. I don't have my email address on here, but it's rkimbrough at tncoalition.org. And we answer questions related to anything related to domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking. So that is my part. Do you have any questions? That's a good question. I do not have any statistics on violation of order of protections, but I do know that that they are handled through the usually through the domestic violence unit. So a victim can call the domestic violence unit. Their number is 880-3000, and to report domestic abuse, or if their order of protection has been violated. An order of protection from out of state is also given what is called full faith and credit here in Tennessee, and therefore on its face, if it's still current, a person can violate it, be held for violation here in Tennessee. And a violation of order of protection is an immediate arrest, and the person must be held, well, the person can be held up to 12 hours. Well, that's a piece of legislation that's being looked at this year, the 12-hour hold. If you go to our website, I do a legal advocacy training every year, and our organization has free training. So if you go to this website, we always have trainings, and I'll be doing a legal advocacy training here in Nashville, and it will be a whole day on these kind of topics. There's going to be a legal advocacy training here in Nashville in September. And we have rescheduled the one for Memphis, which was supposed to be tomorrow. And then I'm not sure which one the Knoxville will be, which date. But we have all kinds of trainings going on. Our training calendar is on our website. Well, yeah, it's not there yet, but Mary Jo, you've asked a good question. That law would help this person. This is a great example on why we need to help victims, especially in rental agreements. Good question. So we take calls from everybody. All right, so we definitely are a resource agency. So if a person needs an advocate and they may not be eligible for any of our legal services on site, we will refer them and connect them with an advocate in their local program. So let's suppose you refer us a sexual assault victim. So that sexual assault victim will get an intake done, and that victim will be set up to meet with an attorney to talk about their sexual assault issues and any legal issues arising out of that sexual assault. And we also have an advocate for our sexual assault clients. But we help everybody that calls through, including batterers. You know, so I help everybody that calls the phone. Well, you raise a good point. but the issue is many of the victims cannot afford attorneys. And sometimes legal aid may not take their case, or any other nonprofit. Now, we certainly could have taken that case, that sexual assault victim's case, and helped her with that lease issue. But we want to help victims who cannot afford attorneys. And so those calls that I took on these issues, I could not be their attorney, but I could only kind of be an advocate and help talk to the landlord, and rather than kind of being their lawyer. So you raise a good point. Great, if you got a lawyer, these are some things you can argue. But if you don't have a lawyer, and it's really difficult. So that's why the Order Protection Act is built the way it is, so victims can get this done without the necessity of having a lawyer. Although having a lawyer is always a plus. I mean, you always want a lawyer, but we want victims to be able to have forms online, because we have standardized petition and order protection petitions and dismissals, and all that's online through the administrative office of the courts, so victims can try to operate. But I'm glad that you raised that, because this is why we need this law. This is why we need laws to help victims.
Well, we appreciate Robin being here.